Welcome to Bamfordrose and another question of the week. In this week's question of the week, I've been asked to identify what the likely sound is from a V8 engine, so it's going to be a 4.3 or a 4.7 exhibiting Tapit shim rattle. So from a previous video, we're going to know that the Tapit shim is located within the bucket, which sits in the head, obviously, acting upon the valve stem, and at the upper side of it, it's going to have the camshaft spinning on it. The Tapit shim located within the bucket gives the correct valve clearance between the bucket and the cam. This is the exhaust cam. See the chain which gets a drive from the inlet cam, and this can be extracted out the front of the engine, no problem. The issue is this variable valve timing unit here, which will not extract out the front cover, which sits about there, which is the reason why if the Tapit shims were out of spec on the inlet cam, the engine has to come out of the car. So this is a Tapit bucket shim which sits inside the cylinder head. The underside of it will contact the valve head, this side will contact the camshaft, and here is where we put a feeler gauge in to measure for the clearance. Now the issue is mainly all of these outer bucket shims are standard, and if you see inside there in the middle is the actual thickness of each individual shim. Now it's this Tapit shim internally within the bucket which becomes dislodged and not seating properly, which causes the excess clearance to be measured here between the cam and the bucket, which is causing the ticking sound. But the louder the tapping sound becomes and the more out of tolerance it is getting, probably means the more compromised the actual shim sitting in the bucket is. And if it becomes completely dislodged, then there will be quite a massive clearance there, and that will sound awful. So prolonging running the engine in this ticking state is just risking a complete failure of this component, which is obviously bad. Now really these should be shimmed and specced for life, and by that manufacturers normally mean 100,000 miles. If the exhaust valves come out of spec, then it's a relatively easy job to fix this, because you can reshim, you can replace the cam bucket with the correct size shim in with the engine in situ. It's a bit of a bigger problem, unfortunately, if it's the inlet cam, because to extract the inlet cam with the engine in place, you're inhibited to do that by the front cover, so you can't actually get the inlet cam out of its place to be able to gain access to the bucket, to withdraw it from its bore, to put a new bucket with the correct grade Tapit shim in place. That means that if it is the inlet that does need to be reshimmed, then unfortunately the engine has to be dropped out with the frame, engine taken out of the frame, engine put on a build stand, front cover taken off, and then you can gain access to remove the inlet cam. So whereas the exhaust side of the engine to reshim is probably contained within a day's labour, then the inlet cam to reshim would probably be like 3 or 4 days labour. So here's a video clip of an engine running that had a measured clearance of 0.27 to 0.29 millimeters. Now this is about 0.034ish above the spec, so this is just out of specification. This was on the exhaust side, fortunately, so this was fixed with the engine in place and for just over a day's worth of labour. You know, this needed just a couple of the shims respecking, because from the noise that you can hear on this video clip, then it's very, very slight. You know, you're probably quite a critical owner if you pick up on this. You've got the injectors tapping as they normally do anyway. You've got the mechanical thrash, normal sort of sound of the engine. So above those noises, to sort of blank those out and listen for this very distinct tapping noise, then it's quite critical. You're certainly not going to hear this when you're sat in the car with a little bit of a radio on, the windows up, that sort of thing. This is something that you're going to hear when the car's ticking over. Maybe you've got the car at the garage, you're shutting the garage door, walking back to the car, and a very critical owner is going to pick up on this very, very slight tapping sound. Now, at that very small amount of excess clearance, then even if you were to race the car, put it on a 24-hour Nürburgring race and thrash the hell out of it, then that's unlikely to get worse, fail, or have anything untoward happen. So this is the onset of detecting the problem, and really it's the onset of needing to fix it. Now we've got a video clip of an engine at the other extreme. This is with quite comical 0.7mm valve clearance. So this is 0.5mm above the spec. Now, as you can hear in this clip, the ticking sound is cyclic, it's repetitive, it's always there. And in this second clip where we rev the engine up, then it actually worsens with speed. It's a distinctive metallic-y type tapping sound. It isn't your normal, say, conrod big end bearing, more deeper, thuddier type knocking sound. And if we go back to the clip with the very small clearance above the maximum tolerance, then you can still hear this distinctive metallic type tap. The excessive clearance that this car was running, for me this is an immediate stop driving. This is a catastrophic failure waiting to happen, and if the problem was fixed now, it would simply be removal of engine from frame, remove the inlet cam and reshim the buckets. Whereas if this was left, you could quite easily be looking at a valve failure, and maybe that compromises valve guide and the complete cylinder head. In the worst case, maybe it would even compromise the valve and drop a valve into the chamber. Whether it's the DB9 V12 dreaded tick, piston slap in the liner, or the small end rattle, then we've got enough videos out there for people to listen to those types of engine sounds, reference that to what their engine is doing, and before they go into a garage, sort of do a little bit of at-home diagnosis. With these two videos here, with a very, very small excessive clearance and a very, very large excessive clearance, then hopefully you can reference this sound and reference yourself whether your engine is making that type of sound or not. On the V8 engine, you can try and determine without measuring the Tapit shim clearance if it is coming from the exhaust side by putting the car up in the air and somewhere downstream after the primary cat, before the secondary cat. Just try and have a listen in the exhaust system. You should be able to hear the sort of tapping sound travelling down the exhaust system. If you do want to measure the Tapit shim clearance, it's incredibly easy on the V8. Just remove your cam covers and immediately you've got access with a feeler gauge to measure the shim clearance between the cam lobe and the bucket. The V12 engine is completely different. It's got hydraulic shims, so you can't really do the same, but this is a video targeted for the V8 engine. And obviously the fix is very simple. You measure the clearance that you have, you look at what the tolerance, the spec should be, and then you re-specify a larger shim to be thicker enough to get you within the tolerance from the gap that you've measured. In the case of the engine with the smaller clearance, this is about 0.27 clearance on this car. If you revved it up and got the engine revs to 3000 RPM, then the very slight excessive clearance meant that above the mechanical thrash of the engine you couldn't really pick out a tappet rattle. In the case of the 0.7mm clearance, obviously you've heard from that video clip there that you rev it up and it actually gets worse. And this is what I would say. If you rev up to about 3000 RPM and maybe a tapping sound that you could previously hear just gets drowned out and you can't hear it at all, then it's probably safe to leave that alone and monitor it for the time being. If you rev it up to 3000 RPM and above, certainly above, and you can still hear it and it's actually very prominent, then this is the time to fix it before anything untoward happens. Now this is an interesting one. I think that the independent world will have a go at fixing this. From my experience, the dealer network doesn't want to, because there isn't a procedure from Aston. Engines are treated as a box within the franchise world, whereas if you have a problem with your engine, then you just get another one off the shelf and put it in. Obviously the Tapit shims is very, very simple. You don't have to split the cylinder head from the block. It can be fixed. Obviously it's a little bit more time consuming and therefore costly if you have to take the engine out because it's the inlet cam, but essentially this is a problem that can be fixed without too much difficulty. Again, at the franchise network, I've heard many stories where the car is on extended warranty and it is making an obvious Tapit shim rattle, but they just won't fix it because it's not a breakdown. This is it's at the upper end of its tolerance, will be the comment, and until the customer actually gets some data from a measurement taken somewhere else and take it back to them. But as I say, the fix is interesting because the dealer network, in my experience, doesn't want to touch this problem. So let us know your comments on if you've had V8 Tapit shim rattle and it's been fixed at dealer or fixed in the independent world. As always, it really helps us if you can subscribe to our channel, click us a like, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next question of the week.